Hi, I'm Juliet Parker and I'm the Director of ALNAP, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our next Learning Curve event, working across the humanitarian-development-peace nexus. How do we move beyond process to real impact? The need to work effectively across these three systems to address longer-term priorities and root causes of crisis is increasingly evident, with the scale of protracted crises, increased fragility and conflict, and the growing threat of climate change. But as we outlined in ALNAP's Sticking Points series last year, the HDP Nexus is an area where actors have struggled to make practical progress. Today, we'll be asking what it really takes to move discussions on the Nexus forward from a focus on policies and processes to tangible impacts for communities. I'm very pleased to introduce our co-hosts for today, Corey Stedman, the Senior Officer on Localization for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies based in Geneva, and Sheetal Rana, the Global Director of Partnership and Localization at Trokra in Kenya. I hope you will find these conversations useful and take away learning on some of the tangible opportunities to practically progress work across the HDP Nexus. And with that, I'll pass over to Corey for our first discussion.
Many thanks, Juliet. The Interagency Standing Committee, or IASC, recently published a new report synthesizing progress on working across the humanitarian development and peace nexus that ALNAP authored with partners in UNICEF and with the support of members of the wider IASC Task Force 4. The new report looks across progress in 11 countries, highlights best practices, and outlines where more progress needs to be made. You will find a link to it and the 11 country briefs in the chat below. Today, we're joined by three of the authors for this report to discuss their key takeaways from the global synthesis. First, I'd like to welcome Ms. Jennifer Doherty. Jen is a Senior Research Fellow at ALNAP and their internal lead for the next State of the Humanitarian System report. Before moving into research a decade ago, Jen worked as a practitioner in both humanitarian and development programming with a strong focus on accountability. Next, we'd like to welcome Mr. Carlo Louis. Carlo is the Knowledge and Management Officer at UNICEF's Program Group. Carlo's focus on the Nexus began with the UN Trust Fund for Human Security. Carlo also has experience in data collection in Uganda and Sudan and emergency operations with the World Food Programme. Lastly, we have Vanessa Wyatt. Vanessa is UNICEF's Global Lead for Conflict Prevention, Fragility, and Peace Building. Vanessa brings with her 20 years of experience in policy on conflict and peace building. Previously, she served as Senior Policy Advisor at Canada's UN Mission and led Canada's Peace Building Commission chairmanship in 2020. Welcome to our three authors. Okay, my first question is to Jen. This new publication serves as an update to a similar synthesis report produced in 2021. How do you think things have changed over the last few years, and where is the room for improvement?
Thanks, Corey. So in short, we found that the Nexus remains a bit of a sticking point for the humanitarian system. Our report surveys with humanitarian country teams and with local and national actors show a mix of good and more challenging news at country level. But I'd say that many of our overall conclusions and recommendations weren't wildly different to the 2021 reports. Yet I do think our findings help us better see where connections are being made and where they're being missed. So areas where we need more concerted effort. On the positive side, coordination around the Nexus is strong across many contexts, especially those that have moved to area-based approaches. They seem to hold quite a lot of promise. And in terms of planning, collective outcomes have now been established in country-level documents like the HRPs and development plans in multiple contexts. And we see subnational Nexus task forces and working groups in several countries. The more challenging news is a bit frustrating because we've heard it before. This time round, we deliberately tried to dig into the question of impact. So is all this coordination leading to outcomes of any scale? But we still see limited evidence of translating country-level coordination into effective joined-up programming. So programming that produces practical outcomes in terms of reductions in needs and vulnerabilities for communities. So I'm not saying that there are no good examples of programming. In the synthesis and the country reports, there are useful ones worth looking at. But overall, the amount pales in comparison to the level of investment in Nexus coordination processes. And generally, beyond some social protection systems or forced migration crises, the translation of country-level plans into program outcomes is weaker. And our understanding of impact isn't helped by the significant gap we see in monitoring and evaluating work across the Nexus. Actors are still looking for clarity on what they should be tracking or even aiming to achieve with this work, asking, do we measure change in our ways of working, or is it tangible changes for communities that we want? So we do hear that monitoring and evaluation can seem technical or adds another layer of administrative burden, but we do need stronger evidence and understanding of the impact made by these efforts, because tracking outcomes more intentionally could help keep momentum going for this important endeavour. So we heard frustrations from actors who've been committed to implementing HDP Nexus approaches for the past 5 years, now feeling fatigued by the seeming lack of tangible impact. And that's worrying. It really underscores the need to focus on tying those positive progresses around coordination processes and planning much more intentionally to practical impacts for people in fragile contexts and being able to capture and recognize those impacts when they do happen.
Thanks, Jen. Carlo and Vanessa, you also worked on the report in your roles at UNICEF. First to Carlo, what were your key takeaways, especially the ones that struck you?
Thanks so much. I'd say that financing for Nexus remains a huge barrier. Out of the 11 countries we surveyed for the report, 10 of them highlighted financing as the biggest challenge to advancing the HDP Nexus. Despite commitments by donor governments to the DAC recommendations to the Nexus in 2019, short-term humanitarian funding still dominates, while longer-term development and peace initiatives remain underfunded. And while we see some good examples of coordination efforts, as Jen mentioned, they need to be accompanied by financing mechanisms for us to achieve scale and impact. So a few examples to share. In the DRC, donors supported provincial nexus groups in piloting integrated approaches to address food insecurity and displacement with the withdrawal of MINUSCO. These provincial nexus groups carried out joint mapping of needs and gaps to promote complementarity of partner interventions. Bringing donors together in this space also encouraged greater contributions to collective outcomes. UNICEF was one of the actors on the ground in the Tanganyika and Kasai provinces, improving access to basic social services to returnees while also promoting social cohesion. Our colleagues noted that the positive impact of joint analysis among stakeholders and among donors really helped towards achieving better outcomes collectively. In Burkina Faso and Somalia, we saw the World Bank supporting social safety net programs that invest in resilience to stress. This has allowed complementary shock responsive systems and development investments alongside the traditional humanitarian response. Similarly, UNICEF here has also been able to socialize Canada as a donor to advance the Nexus approach to address these unmet needs across the humanitarian development and peace pillars, especially when it comes to the delivery of wash services through the National Water and Sanitation Office. So all the more reason for us, both humanitarians and development practitioners, to continue socializing the HDP Nexus among partners. Among my colleagues in the WASH cluster where UNICEF leads, we have seen progress in acknowledging the value of longer-term development activities such as drought resilience water service points in humanitarian response plans. We have also seen examples of agile reprogramming when things go south, demonstrating the added value of crisis modifiers in development programs, especially in fragile contexts. I'd also like to add that we also see climate change as an added impetus to advance the HDP Nexus. While climate financing is a useful organizing tool that bridges the pillars of the Nexus, attracting and making the most of such financing requires greater coordination and alignment. For example, in Vanuatu, we noted some alignment among donors such as France, Australia, New Zealand, but there were still limitations between linking humanitarian response and recovery efforts, and also complementing these funds with the national financing instruments. Without joint analysis or programming, it would be difficult to attract Nexus financing, especially where geopolitics, not contextual risks, are driving funding flows. In essence, effective joint programming that is sustainably funded requires us to socialize donors to see the value of transcending these silos, making the impacts speak for the added value of the Nexus approach.
Thanks, Carlo. It's good to hear some concrete progress, although a bit slow. And now to Vanessa. Your work with UNICEF focuses on peace. Has there been progress with integrating peace into the Nexus? For one, understand that this has always been a sticking point. And so if you can offer as well some examples of useful practice.
Thanks so much, Corey. Yeah, so UNICEF does have longstanding experience on integrating peace into our work, but multiple evaluations have shown that we need to do more to ensure that this is done more systematically and intentionally. Last year, we launched a peace-building framework that helps articulate UNICEF's contribution to peace across 3 dimensions: safety for children and their communities, equity and inclusion in access and delivery of services, and social cohesion. So UNICEF's approach is based on really understanding and addressing root causes and drivers of conflict, and strengthening local capacities for peace, whether we're talking about individual capacities and attitudes and skills, or institutional structures, policies, etc. In that sense, peace building is a lens applied to our existing sectoral and programmatic work. An existing program, or an education program, or a child protection program could have peace building as a secondary objective added on to an existing program, or could be designed with peace building as a primary objective. I'll give a few examples from a couple of sectors where UNICEF plays a leading role in both humanitarian and development settings, and how we're working to integrate peace building into that work. So first, in education. We have longstanding experience in peace building through education in terms of working through the education system to contribute to local and national efforts to build social cohesion. As an example, in Colombia, following the 2016 Peace Accord, we partnered with the Ministry of National Education and regional authorities in 5 conflict-affected regions for a project called Escuelas en Paz, forgive my Spanish, which was a whole of community approach that engaged schools to drive a culture of peace in areas affected by violence, with complementary programming supporting children, adolescents, and their families, including through mental health and psychosocial support. Another sector where I believe UNICEF is making progress more systematically integrating peace and social cohesion into our programming is in water and sanitation. We have a new Wash for Peace toolkit launched this year. We also have really promising programming in both the Sahel and Horn of Africa that is focused on sustainable water management in drought-affected regions and border provinces that are vulnerable to water stress, and are also historic sites of resource-based conflicts over access to water and land, grazing rights, etc., and now, unfortunately, play host to large populations of refugees and IDPs. So programming here includes technical solutions for sustainable water management, coupled with mechanisms to facilitate intergroup dialogue, to help peacefully manage water-based disputes, to work on strengthening the capacity of local authorities and service providers to meet the needs of the population. So horizontal and vertical social cohesion. I would say our key takeaway from all of this is that it really is a challenge to truly integrate cross-cutting priorities across your existing work and to mainstream it. It's obviously a lot easier to create a new silo, but that's not going to advance our objectives. Frameworks and toolkits are necessary, but insufficient. Yes, obviously we need to build capacities within our country offices, but equally important is the need to ensure that we link these efforts to accountabilities and to mechanisms within our corporate planning processes. In particular, we are working to be more intentional with analysis that seeks to identify the root causes and drivers of conflict, define peace-building results, and continue to track how we are doing as an organization. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Vanessa. Now, coming back to you, Jen, do you see the other opportunities for achieving impact via work on the HDP Nexus? and bridging this gap between the process and the practice that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, so Corey, I mentioned that as well as a survey with humanitarian country teams, we conducted one with local and national actors. So this is something new that we added for this edition of the report to really bring their voices more directly into the discussion, beyond those few local organizations usually represented in HCTs. And while engagement and ownership of Nexus coordination by national and local governments seems stronger in some contexts, like Somalia or Vanuatu, we found a clear divide between how the country teams are looking at the Nexus and how it's approached by local and national NGOs and civil society organizations. So at the HCT level, the focus is more on IASC terms like collective outcomes and joint analysis, and how that gets translated downwards to implementers. But in our responses from 125 local actors on their Nexus work, there was not one mention of collective outcomes, which seems quite telling. Instead, the local actors said that they do program level work that's really focused on what communities need and prioritize, and that drives their perception of what's required from their work across the HDP Nexus. And we saw another interesting dichotomy around understanding. So while HCT level reflections discuss the need to help implementing partners understand Nexus plans, local actors said that it's international actors who don't understand the Nexus. So they particularly mentioned artificial silos and limited understanding of local politics as being barriers to effective international engagement. So there's a real disconnect there, but also positively an opportunity. So an opportunity to make better connections and to think of the HDP Nexus more from the perspective of local organizations, those that are already implementing cross-system approaches, who are conscious of local political realities, and who understand the lived experiences of communities that don't divide their lives across the three pillars of the Nexus. And when I say that these organizations are implementing cross-system work, that might seem at odds with what I said before about the lack of practical programming across the Nexus. And here it's a disconnect between levels again. At the country level, we see only a few clear examples of programming mentioned, but over 90% of our local and national actor respondents say that they are implementing practical work that bridge these three systems, with particularly useful examples related to gender and integrating peace into the Nexus. But this work doesn't seem to be tied to what's being planned or counted at the country coordination level, and maybe looks quite different. So there's an opportunity to flip the script a bit there, to look more at the local community embedded perspective of what the Nexus is. Is it even recognized as what we're calling the HDP Nexus in fora like these, or is it something more organic? So this is something one of my colleagues at ALNAP is looking at in another piece of our work. And I'm looking forward to hearing some perspectives and examples much more directly from local organizations rather than me in our discussions today. So thanks, Corey.
Thanks, Jen. Yes, indeed. It looks like, yeah, there is indeed some progress, especially around complementarity, maybe less so in terms of coherence. And maybe just the last point that I really happy that you kind of put emphasis on this, the relevance of looking up from the perspective of local organization on the issue of the HDP Nexus. Right. So thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists, Vanessa, Carlo, and Jen. And I'll hand over to Jen for the next session.
Great. So in this session, we'll be moving a bit from that global picture that we just discussed with Corey to zoom a bit down into what working across the HDP Nexus looks like in different contexts. So we'll be exploring some different countries where the environment for doing work across the Nexus can have an effect on what that looks like and the different challenges and opportunities that are faced. So before we're joined by two other guests, we want to share with you a video reflecting on what working across the Nexus looks like for a women-led organization in Afghanistan. So a context where strong sanctions have hindered organizations from working on longer-term priorities like education and governance, but also where the public role of women is increasingly challenged, meaning we've needed to protect the identity of our video contributor.
After the collapse of the previous government, our organization had to quickly adapt to the new environment under the Taliban rule. Initially, while the restrictions were less intense than they are now, there were significant limitations on women's education. Although universities and other higher education institutions remained open to women, girls were not allowed to attend school beyond grade 6. We consulted female teachers and school administrators for solutions. They proposed implementing bridging classes and accelerated education programs to help female students prepare for university, as higher education was still accessible to them at that time. However, once the Taliban extended restrictions to universities, we were forced to shift to an underground model as our operations could no longer remain in the open. We adapted our policies and communications to align with the new constraints. For example, we adjusted the language in proposals and official documents submitted to donors and ministries, avoiding terms like women's empowerment, which prevented us from securing MOU with some of the ministries under the Taliban scrutiny. By making these adjustments, we have managed to uphold our core principles while adapting to a challenging environment. They say that there is light at the end of any dark tunnel. Facing numerous challenges, we have also managed to find opportunities. Afghanistan's current climate for civil society is extremely restrictive, with opportunities diminishing daily, not only in terms of funding, but also in finding viable pathways to engage with the de facto authorities and reach marginalized, voiceless communities. The restrictive edicts continue to escalate. Despite this, there remains an opportunity to support ground-level civil society organizations led by women and to simplify the rules that affect them. So currently, we're actually working with 15 women-led CSOs across 3 provinces to build coalition and strengthen their capacities. We provide policy-level capacity building, including training on financial, HR, and reporting systems. These NGOs, while led by women, have been forced to appoint male representatives, with the woman acting as a shadow director, so to say. For many women, these organizations provide not only the source of income, unemployment opportunities, but also a living. Our consultations with around 400 women across Afghanistan through our civil society networks reveal that in some provinces, local councils, often aligned with Taliban preferences, control aid distribution, favoring certain individuals. So to address these issues, continued support for these women-led CSOs is really crucial and important. Donors should fund these organizations directly, fostering communication with civil society in other countries, and grant them access to resources and funding. And I also think that bodies like UNAMA could use their influence to advocate against restrictive edicts impacting women, as these issues currently receive insignificant attention.
So a very difficult context, but a commitment to keep working for vulnerable women and tackle issues that go beyond humanitarian needs in a context of sanctions. So our thanks to the contributor for sharing that with us. But with us live on this panel, I'd like to introduce you to Stephanie Youssef, the Deputy MENA Regional Representative for ICFA. So she joins us from Amman in Jordan, and Stephanie has worked in the humanitarian sector since 2011 with experience of promoting inclusion, the HDP Nexus, and localization. And she holds a master's in public administration. And we have Damien Lilly, who has more than 20 years experience working for UN agencies and NGOs in the humanitarian sector. He was most recently Deputy Head of Office for OCHA in Chad and previously the Chief of the Protection Division at UNRWA. He's currently based in Mozambique and working as an independent consultant. So thank you both for joining us. But first, welcoming Damien, who has also helped support the development of the report we just spoke about by coordinating inputs from Chad, where he was working for UN OCHA. So Damien, what did the HDP Nexus approach look like there? And are there areas where you saw some progress?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation and thanks for also sharing the report. It's just to firm is the kind of report that's very useful in the field. I think when you're looking at these issues and wondering how you can kind of tackle it, it's very good to see examples from other places. So yeah, as you said, I was the deputy head of office for OCHA in Chad, arriving just before the Sudan crisis from April 2023. Chad has been one of these countries that's been a priority for the Nexus, I think, since after the World Humanitarian Summit, but it was really the crisis in the east of the country with the refugee outflow from Sudan, which I think provided some important lessons in terms of the Nexus. So what was happening, there was refugees coming across the border, in many ways exactly the same as occurred 20 years ago with the first Darfur crisis, thousands of people coming across, refugee camps being established. But the palpable difference, I think, this time around was that people recognized this wasn't just a humanitarian crisis. It was happening in Eastern Chad, one of the poorest countries in the world. It was having severe developmental impact as well. It was having impacts on social cohesion as well. And the government was very firm in saying, we'll welcome these refugees, but if you don't address our development challenges at the same time, we won't be a reliable partner. And so there was a concerted effort. There was a high-level mission that came from Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed in July last year with some of the heads of all the UN agencies who really underlined this was a multidimensional crisis. And so this joint analysis that you need in terms of the Nexus really came through, that we had this multidimensional crisis. The other thing I think the crisis turned on its head is that most of us, when we talk about the Nexus, talk about it in terms of it being for protracted crisis, whereas we're in the middle of an acute crisis. We're trying to relocate refugees away from the border, but there was this foresight that unless we had a long-term impact, unless we looked at the development impact of the crisis, we were going to end up in a vicious circle where the refugees will end up stuck in these refugee camps for years. The next crucial thing that happened, Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, came with the Managing Director of the World Bank. I think I'm doing another evaluation for UNHCR. People have told me this is the first time that he had done one of these visits with a senior level person from the World Bank. So to engage Development Access very much from the start, they then committed money, investments, though, that it wasn't just about dwindling humanitarian aid, it was also about having development assistance. And then the government really saw this as an opportunity to position themselves. The Sahel, there was coups and various things going on. They really wanted to see themselves as a kind of island stability, someone that would engage with the international community. There was meetings at the General Assembly last year as well, where they talked about this emergency development. And then it came out with the idea to have an integrated plan, an integrated humanitarian development and peace plan, very much what the UN failed to do. It had 3 separate plans, one for refugees, one for migrants, one for everyone else. And so the importance of, national level leadership, having a joint plan. And then the RCHC developed a strategic group for this. So for me, it was one example where there were at least important examples of how this could work. I don't pretend that it was perfect. I don't pretend that there's not enormous challenges, many the same as other people were mentioning just now. But I think it certainly was an interesting example how, a different kind of approach to be taken to what was a similar kind of problem if you look back from how this was happening years ago in the same refugee crisis and the first Darfur crisis. Back to you.
Thanks, Jamie. It's useful to have that longitudinal look, but also the opportunity to dive more into that context and hear how different actors came together in that multidimensional crisis to create that integrated plan. And we will come back to you in a moment, but first I'm going to go to Stephanie. So you've been working on supporting the Nexus for several years, including through a community of practice and recently as part of the IASC Task Force 4. Could you talk about some of the progress and opportunities that you've seen?
Thank you so much for having me. Under the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force 4, there was a community of practice that was established, and it was co-chaired by ICVA and WFP. And this community of practice really took us on a journey to explore examples of implementation of the Nexus approach across Asia, Africa, and Middle East regions. The community of practice also brought together Nexus practitioners to learn about and discuss global technical guidance, such as the advisory note on advancing the HDP Nexus approach through the clusters, and key initiatives like the flagship initiative. These examples discussed best practices, challenges, gaps, and allowed some time for discussion amongst the various actors. All of the work that was done was to ensure implementation of the Nexus approach for two reasons: to meet the global commitment to increase coherence and collaboration across the three pillars, and to meet the global commitment to meet immediate needs and reduce risk and vulnerability over the long term. Various models were presented, and this reiterated the fact that the Nexus must be contextualized and can be contextualized. Different countries were at different levels. Some are in transition phase, some are in protracted crisis, others are in development majority phase. They were all contextualized. So through this journey, we learned about when these initiatives were happening and jointly the goals were set and the activities designed and implemented with the Nexus approach, it became much easier to comprehend. Nexus is not a project, and it's an approach. And this is something that has been understood better over the years. And one of the goals of the community of practice was to help this realization. There has been a stronger realization that local actors are already focusing on the technicalities of the Nexus, and often without labeling it as such. And in all of our community of practice segments, we've included local actors in the work that they're doing. And strengthening partnerships with the local actors is essential, as they have the in-depth contextual knowledge and often are the first responders. Their insights are critical for bridging immediate needs with midterm to the long-term solutions. And it is essential for a Nexus approach to work that we have to increase equitable partnerships, and we are increasing focus on localization. Localization is central to the Nexus, and there's an increasing realization of this. Some progressions include better lines of communication with UN and NGOs, inclusion of NGOs in collective outcomes, establishment of durable solutions platforms or HDP platforms in parallel to the HCT, national strategies designed with NGOs that incorporated this approach, and overall a more comprehensive response to meet the needs for immediate and long term of the people. Some of the challenges that have been come up throughout these community practices are limited system-wide experience and lessons learned on humanitarian development, lack of multi-sectoral platforms to instill the approach and monitor the approach, donor-driven HQ-led decisions that must be ready to share responsibility and ensure resources sufficient to execute responsibly, the funding modalities, and a fit-for-purpose funding models throughout the response is going to help the likelihood of a smooth organic transition through multi-year flexible funding. And then ensuring that we're meeting adequate decision making at the country level. So this is some of the things that we've seen in the community of practice, both progresses and challenges. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Stephanie, for sharing that journey you've been on with the COP. And I think underscoring that important interaction with localization questions again. I do have another question for you, and it's not an easy one. So you're based in Jordan, in a region where we've seen the outbreak of conflict. How can we meaningfully talk about working across the Nexus in contexts like Gaza and Lebanon?
Thank you for this. This is indeed a very difficult question, and what's going on right now in all the neighboring countries around us. But it's important that we do talk about this because there's a lot of lessons learned. You know, prior to the war, humanitarian development partners worked together diligently, building up mechanisms that are in line with the Nexus approach. OCHA has advocated to promote the new way of working, particularly when it comes to framing the work of humanitarian development actors along with national and local counterparts in support of collective outcomes. Now, in the occupied Palestinian territories and in Lebanon, various NGOs have implemented many programs with the Nexus approach in mind through multi-year and flexible funding. There are many examples that you can see of best practices that occurred in both OPT and Lebanon, and there's not enough time to show them all today. However, after the war, there was a setback. And at the beginning, there was a suspension of funds by development actors, causing a rift among civil society actors. Despite the complexity of the crisis and the funding suspension, Nexus actors still found a way to coordinate because there was trust built in the relationships that have been being built over the years between humanitarian development partners and the national authorities. And this allowed for continued coordination during the current crisis. However, Nexus partners continue to face funding constraints, donor policies that are favoring short-term and targeted interventions rather than comprehensive approaches, and more advocacy needs to be done for this. Some very impactful interventions in the OPT included social protection and cash assistance. But this emergency brought additional pressure. Besides the existing administrative and logistical bottlenecks caused by the political and geographical divide, the crisis affected the ministry's capacity to intervene and the humanitarian partners along with national agencies. It affected the ability to engage with de facto authorities and the implications on disbursement of funding to the National Cash Program due to the tightening of international donor policies. Nevertheless, the actors are continuing to have this conversation and have put together something with UNRWA. But then, once again, it was struck when UNRWA was put on hold and it was banned from the Israeli territories. So Nexus partners have realized that they are facing difficulties. However, continued dialogue remains. The thematic working group that was set up is still there, and they enabled their progress on policy reform and advanced joint efforts on different program alignment. In the lessons learned, we're seeing that, and by the way, cash programming was the first programming that did hit Gaza also, and it was very important and crucial and critical for the people of Gaza. So this kind of, Nexus approach ended up extremely successful, but facing so many difficulties due to the incredibly difficult context. Now, we have seen the impactful intervention that shows us how the engagement of governments and the diplomacy side, and the big P, if you will, is the driver of both the humanitarian and the development response. The Nexus cannot go away because of war. Rather, the Nexus is a means to an end result, ultimately aimed at ensuring humanitarian development donors work together to serve those impacted by war and to strengthen resilience during stability. This is the people-centered approach. It is vital and demonstrates well why the Nexus is fundamentally about improving outcomes for the affected population. Regardless of the challenges, we have learned that we must work to overcome them and make sure that we are speaking to both all humanitarian, development, and peace actors. The devastating impact of the blockade in UNRWA and donor conditionality is something that we continue to advocate for, and I would certainly encourage all actors to dive into these contexts a little bit closer and examine what it takes to ensure proper Nexus coordination in protracted crises that have transitioned and re-entered into war. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And I think there's just not enough time for us to unpack all of that on such an important topic. I'm sure people will want to pick up on those issues in more depth. But for the moment, I'm going to turn back to Damien with another relatively big question. So from your experience in Chad and elsewhere, where do you think current practice gets it wrong, and what needs to change to make the HDP Nexus agenda really work?
I think the experience I've had, and you touched upon it in the report, is that there's a fatigue around the Nexus and there's frustration about implementation. And I think that's born out of the fact that it's based on false assumptions. The way that it was designed many, many years ago was predicated on certain things that aren't actually happening. And I think if we recognize that and design it in a different way, we have more chance of it achieving something. And so I think a lot of it will come from this bottom-up and organic approaches and many of the things that people have mentioned, the programs which really are putting into practice. But unless you fundamentally change the way in which the aid system is designed, I can't foresee that it will be able to achieve what it set out to do. And so some of these assumptions that it was based on are just, for my mind, are not really relevant or hold any longer. I mean, first around the fact that Nexus is, as everyone has mentioned, is an approach, not a goal. And yet that causes a lot of frustration. We don't have a way to articulate what we're trying to achieve in these crises. We use labels like humanitarian, we use labels like development and peace, but we don't have something that collectively we are trying to aim to achieve and that we can move towards. I worked with UNRWA for a number of years. There is no emergency department in UNRWA. There is no development department in UNRWA. There's no peace department in UNRWA. There are sectors. There are things that the agency does. These labels are, irrelevant in many ways. There are things that donors label with particular money. They're the way that we organize some of our coordination. But if you look, and we heard from some of the, local actors, some of these terms are just irrelevant. The problems that they're trying to deal with are much more important. So I think around the language and around the concepts, we need to somehow move on for that. I think the second false assumption is we think that humanitarian peace development plans will suddenly miraculously, coordinate and complement each other, and we all have the same interests. In Chad, I sat on the floor below development colleagues in the resident coordinator's office. I knew all the colleagues. We all had the best interests in the world, and yet we didn't have in any way aligned plans. We didn't have in any way, joint endeavors. I said it was only when the government really brought us together. I think until we move towards having a collective plan that is for all humanitarian development and peace actors, I don't think that we will necessarily move. The Nexus is born on this idea that we will have complementarity, we will work together. I don't think that will work unless you have a joint endeavor that everyone's engaged in. And then thirdly, the coordination. Humanitarian clusters are coordinated very well. There's very little coordination on the development side, especially at the subnational level. We had no representation from UNDP at the subnational level. In Chad, there was no one from the resident coordinator's office. OCHA de facto had to coordinate development actors. So these Nexus working groups are useful, but they tend to ghettoize the discussion. And unless you change and redesign the coordination structures, people have talked about area-based coordination, unless you design them in a different way, there's not going to be a move from that. And then lastly, funding, and people have mentioned this as well. The whole basis of the Nexus is that development funding comes in to take over from humanitarian. That just doesn't exist in many contexts. In fact, it's probably more unlikely than likely. Where I'm at the moment in Mozambique, there is an engaged development community. That is not in any way the same case in Chad. Development funding is not much more than humanitarian funding. It's very difficult to make this transition. So unless you fundamentally look at the different ways in which you're going to design funding strategies, you're going to get stuck in what I called this kind of Nexus trap, where you just don't move out of this kind of funding challenge. There are practical things that donors can do. The Swiss government has merged their development and humanitarian departments now. For my mind, a different form of earmarking should be allowed, where agencies should be able to use interchangeably humanitarian development money for the same activity. At the end of the day, they do this, they should be given the latitude to do this. So funding also needs to change. But I think it's almost 10 years since the supposed new way of working, the supposed Nexus approach. I think there needs to be a fundamental look about the way that which it's designed if we're really going to make any progress over the next decade on this issue.
Thank you. There's some really big questions on our assumptions, the silos, and even the lexicon we're using around this topic. So thank you both so much. It's been great to talk with you again. And also, I think a lot to reflect on there that we can hopefully pick up in the Q&A. I think it's interesting that we talked earlier about finding it challenging to put peace in the Nexus. But I think we see from this discussion the real impact on the other two systems when peace is taken away. With that, I'd like to hand the baton to my other co-host, Sheetal, for our next discussion.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. Now we move to the final session for today, where we shift from different contexts to a range of actors that come together to make HDP Nexus work in a context. We will be focusing on Somalia and how the Triple Nexus is being implemented there by different actors. So with pleasure, I introduce our speakers for this session. First, we have Zainab Mohammed Mota, Program Lead and Head of Office in Somalia at ADESO. Zainab has extensive experience leading projects and operations in Somalia and Kenya with a focus on community development and resilience building. She's committed to creating positive change and empowering communities. Then, joining Zainab, we have Miguel de Correll, Senior Operations Officer in the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group. In this role, Miguel provides strategic analytical support to World Bank's country teams to address the underlying drivers and impacts of fragility, conflict, and violence, particularly in Somalia, Kenya, and the Horn of Africa region. Welcome, Miguel. We were also expected to be joined by Mohamed Yarrow, Executive Director of the Center for Peace and Democracy. Unfortunately, due to an emergency, he could not join us today. However, he has kindly shared his views on HDP Nexus in an article, the link to which we will place in the chat. We wish him all the best, and I encourage you to review his insights. Now to the conversation. We'll start with Zainab. Due to the internet connectivity issue, Zainab recorded her input for today. She will be speaking about an approach called Survivor and Community-Led Response, SCLR, which EDASO is using in their programming to incorporate HDP Nexus. We asked Zainab to share a bit about SCLR approach and why it's important to supporting work across HDP Nexus in the region. Let's hear from Zainab.
So Sahan Saho, Survivor Community-Led Response, SCLR. In Somalia, Sahan Saho describes the sweet, fresh smell, the first raindrops that fall on the ground. So it symbolizes renewal, hope, and the relief that communities experience when meaningful change begins. So Sahan Saho was first launched in December 2022. It's built on the idea of empowering local communities to lead their own development by providing microgrants. So we provide small, flexible grants under $5,000, and these grants enable community groups to implement solutions that are specifically tailored to their needs and the context without the constraint of traditional funding mechanisms. The approach shifts the focus from external interventions to community ownership. It supports the transition from aid dependency to self-reliance by allowing communities to take charge of their own recovery, development, and peace-building efforts. Our approach is very simple. Sahan Saho approach goes beyond the normal traditional aid by giving communities control. We focus on trust, teamwork, respect, and leading real impact. So we focus on immediate relief and recovery. By giving microgrants, we help communities provide vital support during droughts, displacement, food shortages, and so on. And then our next approach is letting communities take charge. Sahan Saho, we both pride, responsibility, and confidence, and we let our communities feel valued and empowered to solve their own problems. So an example I'm going to give is in Rad, we had a village in Puntland, it's called Rad Village, where we worked with a local group that had a history of helping vulnerable members. So we gave them a micro grant. They had written a proposal where they were having security issues. The town didn't have solar lights, street lights. So we gave them a micro grant, and this significantly improved their safety once they set up the solar system, the solar street lights. So this demonstrates how Sahan Saho is a community-led model, and we address not only humanitarian needs, but support development.
Thank you, Zainab, for that thoughtful insight into the SCLR approach. I really like that. I would like to emphasize the focus, trust, teamwork, and respect. That is so meaningful for promoting local leadership. Turning now to you, Miguel. Funding has come up several times and is often highlighted as a key challenge to realizing Triple Nexus. However, in the mapping report, World Bank's work did come through as examples of positive engagement. Could you share what the World Bank has been doing in Somalia to bridge the sometimes siloed systems?
Great. No, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So for Somalia, the World Bank's portfolio has expanded quite a bit in recent years. Currently, we provide around $2.4 billion in development financing across a range of different sectors. And I think importantly, one thing to stress is that we work through country systems, right? So our focus, our objective is really on how to build state legitimacy, visibility, and presence to address some of those underlying drivers of fragility, conflict, and violence that fundamentally undermine long-term stability and development. Having said this, so partnerships with HDP partners, including UN agencies, NGOs, are absolutely essential to be able to implement this portfolio and deliver tangible results on the ground in such a challenging and complex operating context. So this means that for several projects, resources are channeled through the government to UN agencies and NGOs to deliver World Bank financed operations. And so through this approach, the World Bank provides predictable development financing and strengthens the government's ability to manage a growing development portfolio and respond to shocks. But it then leverages the operational presence and capacity of UN agencies and other HDP partners to deliver assistance to communities on the ground. And this partnership model essentially represents around a quarter of our portfolio. So in terms of how does this actually work in practice, let me just give a couple of examples. So one example, and I think it has been highlighted before, and it's also highlighted in the report, is the World Bank's financed Bahnano project, which is essentially a social protection project that provides predictable cash transfers to around 200,000 families in Somalia. Now, this is done with the support of UN agencies, and so through this project, WFP delivers emergency cash transfers in response to shocks, while then UNICEF has helped to build the social protection systems that will then be essential for direct government management of these social safety net programs in the future, right? Another example is through a Somalia urban resilience project that we work with local municipalities in cities such as Mogadishu, Kismayo, Baidoa, Samareb, etc., as well as UNOPS, IOM, to both strengthen local government systems and then also support service delivery and resilient infrastructure, including to IDPs. And one thing I would also just want to stress that beyond kind of the financing element, I know that's the nature of the question. I really think that that's only part of the equation, right? So financing is critical, but really effective partnerships across the Nexus really go beyond financing, right? So for Somalia, which I think partnerships is so fundamental to how we work, we actually have a joint UN World Bank liaison officer function embedded, right? Kind of a staffing position that helps advance shared priorities, foster strategic dialogue between both institutions, and then ultimately support the effective implementation of this nexus and this portfolio in practice, right? And also, we regularly also share lessons, collaborate on core analytical work, including to deepen our collective understanding of some of these fragility, conflict, and violence dynamics in Somalia. So let me leave it there, but very happy to further discuss.
Thank you, Miguel, for that response on the World Bank's work. Predictable development financing, really important and key in locally led action. You've already touched on effective partnership as fundamental to this work. So building on to that, my next question is, what opportunities and partnerships do you think are necessary for World Bank to achieve a more lasting impact in fragile contexts?
No, thanks so much, and I think it's a really critical question. I'll answer in a way through the lens of Somalia, but I really think kind of some of these points are applicable across the board in other fragile and conflict-affected contexts the World Bank engages in. Like I said, I really think partnerships are absolutely essential to our engagement in fragile settings. As a development actor, to be able to operate in these environments, oftentimes where we don't necessarily have the on-the-ground presence that many of our humanitarian peace-building partners have in some of these places, it's absolutely essential, right? I think we can further maximize our impact on the ground, I think, in three ways. First, we need to really balance between short-term delivery needs and longer-term systems and state-building objectives. So to this end, how can we leverage partnerships with humanitarian and peace-building partners to first deliver results, tangible results on the ground, whilst contributing to strengthening the capacity of state institutions to more sustainably manage, administer, or perhaps even deliver some of these services over the long term, right? So how can we better leverage these partnerships both to achieve short-term kind of goals whilst contributing to that longer-term kind of capacity and state delivery objectives over the long term? I think this is really absolutely critical to strengthening the visibility and ultimately the legitimacy of the state over the long term. Second, from the World Bank side, I think we also need to expand our partnerships with NGOs, CSOs more systematically. I think we have very good examples, including in countries like Somalia. I think we can do this at a more systematic level, and especially with those organizations that have long-standing community relationships and on-the-ground presence. This is absolutely crucial to being able to deliver also in highly insecure areas where government control can often be contested or absent. And I think also, beyond also kind of downstream delivery, right, which is what I've been discussing. I think the partnerships with HDP partners, including NGOs, CSOs, can also be critical to strengthen citizen engagement, also participatory planning processes, for example. And then third, I think we can leverage partnerships across the HDP Nexus to make progress on also key reforms, right, and policies that we need to address the underlying drivers of fragility, conflict, and violence. So aligning with partners on major reforms, right? For instance, in the case of Somalia, that can be to build intergovernmental collaboration, advance on security sector reforms, strengthen state-society relations. This is absolutely, I think, critical to collectively push in the same direction on some of the reforms or policies that will be key to helping the country, in this case Somalia, but also in other countries, to being able to help transition out of these states of fragility over the long term.
Thank you, Miguel, for highlighting those opportunities and partnerships very relevant for the work that we do as INGOs, and I'm sure for local and national organizations as well. Now, turning back to Zainab, who also shared, we asked Zainab to share her perspectives on the changes needed and how international actors engage with local and national actors to better support the efforts across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. Let's hear her thoughts on this.
For us, one key change needed in international engagement is international actors must shift from traditional top-down approaches to supporting local-led solutions. Local and national actors understand their challenges best. You know, we're in the ground, we're with the communities, we know what we need, what we want, what help we need. Yet we often face barriers in assessing resources and decision-making spaces. So international actors should focus on empowering local communities, empowering local NGOs, and by providing them the right tools, the right resources, and the autonomy they need to lead their own development. So this means recognizing the value of local knowledge and fostering partnerships that not only respect the leadership of local groups, but trust us to make the right decisions. A practical change could involve international organizations recognizing and investing in local capacities. For example, decentralizing decision-making and fostering an environment where local actors can drive initiatives will encourage more sustainable and culturally relevant interventions. Supporting grassroots organizations like ADESO, especially with our approach with Sahan Saho, where we're working directly with community groups and empowering them with the right support. It demonstrates strong local ownership and an ability to address both immediate and long-term needs. So it's very important that international organizations recognize this and invest in local capacities. Also, I would say in the case of Sahan Saho, this would involve greater flexibility in funding and less reliance on, those predefined project frameworks. A good example of this is the adaptability of the microgrants model, where communities have the freedom to design solutions tailored to their needs. By investing in local capacity and encouraging local ownership, international actors can create more sustainable, context-specific outcomes that bridge the gap between humanitarian aid development and peace-building efforts.
Thank you, Zainab, for that very thoughtful response. This was really great. Thank you, I think, to both Zainab and Miguel for sharing your insights for today. Lots of learning to take away from. While Zainab and Mohammed couldn't join us due to unforeseen circumstances, we appreciate the input, Zainab to recorded contribution and Mohammed to written thoughts, which we put on the link to which we put on chat. Yeah, this concludes our session on Somalia and the HDP Nexus. We hope that the discussion has offered valuable perspectives on how local actors can collaborate, local international actors can collaborate effectively in taking forward HDP Nexus in fragile and conflict context. I will now hand over to Corey Stedman for the next session. Over to you, Corey.
Many thanks, Shital. There's been some very good discussions. I was following the comments, and we are very much on time, even are ahead a few minutes. That's really good. Okay, so we have 20 minutes, more or less, for our Q&A. And I have some questions already here. Okay, I'll start with a question to Damien. This one is from Massimo Alone. So the question is, so it's true that some mechanisms are made in a way that do not help, but for instance, if we see that every UN agency has spent time and money to develop a different HDPN strategy, saying more or less the same things, and no one of them never mentions the name of any other UN agency working in humanitarian crisis, mentioning the possibility to collaborate, does it seem to you that as a facade operation to make it was a facade operation to make some donors happy or interested in HDPN?
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience of UN agencies is that there's a policy on joint programming. UN agencies come together to implement Nexus programs. It's something that intrinsically no agency can do. Normally, the panoply of things that you need in a kind of Nexus environment to do everything from peace to development to humanitarian. And so I think there is a natural way in which agencies are forced to work together. There is this joint program. At the end of the day, there are lots of these agencies are competing over funding, and whereas they might have their own individual approaches as part of the Nexus, and many of them invested in their own policies and strategies, and we've heard from UNICEF and others that are doing that. I think the wider system, in terms of how they're coordinated and they're brought together, is the thing that's not working. So you have a resident coordinator, a humanitarian coordinator is the same person. And so they are playing this role, but you have OCHA on the one side that coordinates humanitarian affairs. You have DCO, which coordinates the development one, not in any way the same level of resourcing. There is very little, from my experience, coordination on the peace side. You don't even get kind of peace, but there's no natural leader to coordinate the peace building part. Perhaps it's UNDP. And so I would say it's more about these interagency things. I would see that, and I've written about it before, that DCO and OCHA should at least be co-located, if not brought together in some way to collectively coordinate some of these activities rather than just doing it in silos. Exactly the same thing happened with the UN Pillar on Peace and Security a few years ago, where the peace building was brought together with the political to have a seamless support to agencies recognizing the continuum from conflict prevention all the way to peace building. It's the same between the humanitarian development. I think that OCHA and DCO should be working much, much more closely together on this. So I think it's more about, the interagency process is not necessarily about how individual agencies are necessarily dealing with it.
Thanks. It's always tricky operationalizing all this very disjointed kind of processes. The next question is to Miguel. The question is from Catherine Martin. What is the role of multilaterals in leading on the Nexus?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the question. I would say, I think multilaterals and including the bank have an important role in operationalizing the Nexus. I think there are certain things that we've done at a global level over the recent years, which I think helps. For instance, we have global level MOUs with the United Nations, ICRC, right? To be able essentially to facilitate this type of a partnership across different fragile settings, right? So that we don't have also let's say an unevenness, right, in how we kind of work, right, whether it's in the Somalia or the Chad or the Yemen, etc., right, so that we have kind of a set of expected roles and responsibilities. So I think that's an important step. I do think, as I said, one thing that we should do more of is systematize a bit more the partnerships with civil society organizations. Again, especially those with longstanding community relationships and on-the-ground presence. I really think that is absolutely essential, and I think that's something from the World Bank side that I think we can do more of. And again, we do have very good examples, but it's a bit more uneven, right? And so, how can we more systematically or regularly do that? And then I think the modality of partnership, that's something that again we can systematize a bit more and also communicate better on I think the expected modality of partnership on the ground, right? So as I said, we have this approach in Somalia that is essentially, let's say, a tripartite partnership approach that we have the government kind of in the center and supported by the World Bank, and then UN agencies are NGOs, right? So And I really think this is absolutely critical, right? Because it really ultimately recognizes that, on our side, the government is our client, right? This is the World Bank. These are government projects that just happen to be financed by the World Bank. But it also recognizes that they may not have the capacity to be able to actually downstream deliver, right? And that's why we then require the partnership of UN agencies, NGOs, right? And I think that type of modality of partnership, that is something that I think could be more systematically done across other fragile contexts, because I really think it's a good example about bridging this or having this balance between short-term delivery objectives and the longer-term systems and state-building objectives that we're trying to achieve in different fragile settings.
Thanks very much, Miguel. So I have a couple more questions here, but just to remind people, you can still put your questions in the chat, and my colleague will send it to me. And also, if people have questions, and Zainab or Mohammed, you can add this question in the chat, and we will ask them if they can respond in writing, and then we'll share that with the event recording to registered participants. Okay, so next question is to Vanessa from Gabriel Fox. This was answered in the chat, but we felt like it's really a very good kind of question. We can elaborate and for everyone to hear about. So Vanessa, do you have recommendations on what mechanisms will enable more efficient collaboration across UN agencies, and what would this look like?
Thanks. I've been responding in the chat on this. I mean, these are pretty basic mechanisms that I'm talking about, but I do think certainly from UNICEF's side, we have found that we are working better in a more joint way with other agencies, and we are working more systematically on peace in contexts where a country has sought eligibility to the Peace Building Fund. And so I think that's for multiple reasons. First, the fact that the government itself has articulated peace building as a national priority and requested help from the UN in supporting these priorities enables a conversation across the UN system on how to support the government on these issues in a way that sometimes is seen as very politically sensitive, and maybe governments are not necessarily open to having those discussions. And so just the fact that it opens the door to that is in itself already helpful. There's that political support for that. But then it creates, the fact that there is a pooled funding mechanism that mandates that agencies work together, that do joint analysis and submit joint proposals, has really helped overcome some of these barriers to working together. And in many cases, can lead to projects that maybe are followed on with funding from other sources. And so I think that is one good example. And then the other example, for which I think there's been ample demonstration of proof of concept, but unfortunately not sustainable funding, is the UNDP DPPA joint program on building, I think it's building national capacity or capacities for peace, which has really supported the deployment of peace and development advisors in RC offices, which, I think the best case is where you have the pot of money provided by the Peace Building Fund, you have a PDA that helps coordinate the UN agencies working together on that. I think you do see more integrated analysis and more, you have like dedicated support within an RC's office on the peace pillar, which otherwise, as Damien said, doesn't necessarily happen and is left to, a lot of different actors to scramble to put together within their own agencies, mandates and constraints. And so I think it's really unfortunate that as a system, we have not been able to standardize this, and that, the joint program is still actually struggling for funding, and we see the reduction in the deployment of PDAs, because I do think they're a real asset for the entire country team.
Yeah. It's true. And I guess, adding into the mix other key actors, such as stakeholders, such as you mentioned, the local actors. Okay, moving on to the next question is to Jen. The question, so the Nexus is always about asking development actors to do more, because what people want would be political rights, economic possibilities, and sustainable results. 6 years on, development actors are mostly not doing any more of that, except such as the World Bank. So should humanitarians now take this set of community development projects on?
That's an interesting question, and maybe Miguel might have more reflections on this as well. But I wish we could throw open some of this discussion a bit more to perspectives of development actors, particularly if we've got some in the event and who could give some thoughts in the chat. But when I've had the opportunity to speak with some different actors more focused on development about the HDP Nexus, I think their view can be a little bit different, and that sometimes working with humanitarians and making that bridge hasn't always been so easy, partly because of the quite structured coordination nature of the humanitarian sector that can really get things done, but it can also feel quite hard to integrate into. And there are different priorities of some development actors or IFIs, and particularly thinking about investments and risk appetites, but also influenced by government interests, as we see more donor country governments perhaps looking more to national interest in how they spend their development money, which can really make that plan for development actors to be that silver bullet in fragile contexts not always seems so feasible. And whether humanitarians can take this on more is a really big question in this period of funding cuts, where we had a big increase and then funding seems to have fallen off that ledge, with actors talking about the need to prioritize, and we're hearing about cuts. And I can share some questions that I've heard in recent discussions when we're developing our next State of the Humanitarian System report. The questions of whether expansion has already gone too far, whether humanitarians haven't exited where they could, and that's led to this need for potentially sharp contractions now. And there are a lot of questions about other remits, particularly in protracted contexts, and the question of climate change and how far to move into adaptation and resilience. And that's a big one that's coming up at the moment, particularly with new financing in the climate side. And I think that we see humanitarians really moving in different directions on these things, some to a bigger scope and seeing where else they could tap into funding, or really drawing back to basics. And I think it's partly a question of skill sets in these different types of complex longer term programming, and maybe dual mandate organizations are perhaps in an opportunity to think through that more. But in closing, this could really be another area to look to local organizations and their more holistic approaches and their connections to communities who might feel more naturally able to bridge these areas and do more on the community development side if they had more of that opportunity and flexibility in funding there.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, that's an interesting offer to to development actors and to those in the peace building sector, I guess, as well. So the next question is from Joseph Okumo, and this is for Stephanie. So Joseph's question is, how would you redesign HDP Nexus without appearing to replicate what UN agencies are already doing?
Thank you so much for the question. I think this is a good one. And the answer is I wouldn't redesign HDP Nexus, to replicate what the UN is doing. I would make sure that we are including and we are being inclusive of all the various actors, whether it's humanitarian development or peace building actors. What the issue that we are seeing with the UN is there's a lot of really good work that's done. But unfortunately, sometimes it's not being inclusive, it's not communicated properly, and bringing together all the domains. We see that potentially the HCRC offices, as part of one of the guidance, should be bringing together actors from all the domains to actually put together the collective outcomes. And we don't have any monitoring mechanism that is in place. There's no way that we can go back and say, hey, this is what's being done and what's not being done. So I would say that we work on ensuring that we are having a proper monitoring mechanism that is placed, ensuring that we're inclusive of the NGOs from all the various dimensions, and specifically local actors. So it's not redesigning, it's communicating better, it's coming together, it's putting a place in our agenda to reach out to the actors and say, hey, we're doing this. How can we make it through the next approach? How can we we're looking at these immediate needs. How can we look at mid and long-term needs? So it's coming together and speaking, I think, communicating better. This seems to be a weakness, but it's not reinventing the wheel or redesigning the HDP Nexus.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. To Carlo, The question is from Carla Lacerda. So she says, I see Nexus as increased coherence. So how much do you think RCOs, HCs, RCS roles are empowered to increase the coherence between humanitarian and development action?
Thanks for the question. First, I wish this was asked to an RCHC to give their empirical experience on this, but I would say that, it really depends. I do feel that sometimes some RCs and HCs are indeed empowered, but some of them also maybe may not leverage the full extent of that empowerment, right? So we have seen, and through the mapping exercise examples where RCs, HCs have facilitated, HCTs transition into like Nexus advisory groups or being instrumental in establishing donor coordination frameworks to align funding priorities with the HDP Nexus, pushing for like an area-based approach, integration of collective outcomes, and et cetera. So without any doubt, the role of an RCHC in sort of getting the house in order, if you will, on board to the Nexus approach is quite instrumental. That said, it shouldn't all fall to the RCHC, right? We also know that sometimes there are limitations to the scope of authority of an RCHC over sectoral actors, right? Particularly those maybe in development and peace who may have their own sort of like agency-specific mandates, right? So we also need, our respective agencies and our sectoral leads to also pull their weight and be part of the community to pursue the HDP Nexus. In my intervention earlier, I was making the point that coordination structures need to be aligned and backed up with resources, right? So again, that's another thing. If there are coordination structures in place and the RCHC puts in all that effort, but there are insufficient resources, technical expertise even, to operationalize these Nexus plans effectively, you're going to fall short in terms of impact, right? So I think some things that can go beyond the RCHC hat, I think having dedicated Nexus advisors or government engagement, or even just like better collaboration in joint analyses among partners on the ground is quite key, right? And that goes beyond just the RCHC. So yes, to Carla, increased coherence is key, but it doesn't all fall to the RCHC to achieve said coherence.
Thanks, Carlo. We have a very good kind of question to as a last question that can be answered by all of you in the panel. So make a kind of 1.5 minute pitch to this question. So this one is from Carmel Delan. So has the panel experience any clarity, or do they have clarity on how best to measure the added value or impact of the Nexus approach that can be useful to countries as they look towards operationalization? Sorry about that. Okay, who wants to take it first? Should I say it again? Okay. So has the panel experience of or clarity on how best to measure the added value or impact of the Nexus approach that can be useful to countries as they look towards operationalization? Wants to go first? Should I go start on my screen? Miguel, would you have some thoughts on that?
I was hoping someone else would come in, but very happy to kind of to try my luck. Listen, I think there's probably much better people on the screen that have much more experience than I do on kind of measuring kind of the impact of HDP Nexus. I think from our end, what we try to. I think if we're looking at also kind of in terms of sustainable kind of results and impact, right? When we measure kind of the results of our own kind of programming, I think we need to kind of report on how many communities, people are on the ground, have received better health services, education services, etc. But I think at the other side, we need to see, have we improved? How do we measure an improvement in the capacity of state institutions, government institutions, to be able to administer, manage, deliver these types of systems over the long term, right? And I think that's what when we're looking at kind of our success, right? If we look at kind of our country strategies, we look at both of these things, right? Again, measuring kind of results on the ground, but also the systems of the government, because ultimately, I think this is quite critical to sustainably making kind of an impact, right? And so again, that's not probably the best answer, but at least that's the type of kind of things that we look on when we're measuring kind of a longer term kind of progress.
Thanks. So Carlo, and then perhaps Jen.
Sure, happy to tackle this question. I feel like it speaks to my work as in knowledge management here in UNICEF. We get this question a lot, and it's an issue that we continue to grapple with. How do we measure the added value or impact of the Nexus approach? First of all, even just labeling or trying to figure out where those good examples of Nexus approach can be challenging. I mentioned earlier that, and in the chat, that sometimes our colleagues may already be doing the Nexus approach, but they don't realize that that's what it is, right? There are many good examples across UNICEF and maybe also partner organizations doing it. So collecting that information, actually doing proper documentation, I think is the first step and key. And a little bit of a shameless plug, the DAC UN adherents, for example, are looking at developing or putting together an evidence base precisely for this reason. We recognize that there was a need for more concrete data and evidence that shows the added value and the impact of the Nexus. This includes, numbers and figures, maybe qualitative and quantitative data to make the business case for the Nexus, right? So we were one of the organizations that developed the concept note for this evidence base. So hopefully down the line, we would be able to back it up with more concrete examples. But maybe just to answer the question from Carmel, I would advocate for strong documentation, right? First of all, making sure that we understand what is the Nexus approach, right? How is that being done in our respective areas of work, capturing that knowledge and using that, right? So here at UNICEF, one of my primary roles is to actually do that documentation work, write case studies, and it has been quite useful because it's informed a lot of our advice, our country office to support to colleagues on the ground that may want to incorporate the Nexus approach in their country programming. And it's also been very useful in mobilizing resources because we can go in front of a donor and say, this has been the impact of the Nexus approach. So I realize my answer is very knowledge management focused, but I do think that is a key aspect in improving or capturing and measuring that added value.
Thanks, Carlo. Maybe as to slightly kind of rephrase the question as well, and then kind of request Jen, is that what impact are actually we're looking at, we wanted to kind of measure. We can maybe expound on that. And then I also see Damien has got something to say. Over to you, Jen.
Okay, I'll keep this really short as we don't have a lot of time, but the impact question was a huge thing that we felt as a gap within the IASC report. We deliberately asked questions around that, and we saw small parts of it, like measurements of avoiding conflict between different people in certain regions, and the kind of estimation of what didn't happen as a result of programming and that sort of counterfactual. But we didn't see many examples of actually measuring impact and outcomes. It was very much more process level. And this is the gap around the monitoring and evaluation that ALNAP, in another report that was published last year by my colleague Susanna and her co-author, was really looking around an evaluation synthesis on the Nexus. And this is an area where we identified as needing more work. And so great to hear that people like Carlo are working on this, but it would be brilliant to be in touch with others who are doing this. And I know my colleague Susanna would be really keen to have some of those discussions as well. So some examples in the report of impact, but quite narrow and really an area we need to be working on. And defining what is the impact we need to have. Is it just around ways of working, or is it really about the vulnerabilities for communities in fragile contexts?
Thanks, Jen. And if Damien and Stephanie can come in quickly. Damien, over to you first.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties of measuring success or the impact of the Nexus is it's an approach, it's not a goal. So you're talking about ways of working. So you can measure things like, are there more advisors? Are there more strategies? Are there more working groups? And in many ways, this is what this mapping report has done, which is useful in itself, but it rests on a huge assumption that more working groups are going to improve things, more advisors are going to improve things. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. So unless we look at it in a different way and say, no, what we're trying to measure is not the ways of working, it's what we're actually doing, and whether we're collectively saying, are we achieving something not by what we do in a humanitarian sense, development, peace, but by a collective sense, we won't be able to measure whether there's the impact. Now, in Chad, in the UN sense, and sorry, we have spoken a lot about the UN, there is a development plan. There is something called, it has indicators, and there's a humanitarian one. When I got there, I was like, well, why didn't we have a common, indicator framework? I went and looked in both plans and they had the same indicators trying to do the same things. And so there was no requirement that collectively the UN had to report on what it was doing collectively, not on a humanitarian development or a peace center, but what it was collectively doing on all of them, because it is so structured in a siloed way. Now, the Nexus approach is, well, why don't you coordinate a bit more? Why don't you all trying to do this thing, get on a bit, do something? That's not going to work unless you specifically ask them to have a joint plan against which they are obliged to report that they're collectively doing something together. Then it won't happen. These collective outcomes is a great idea, but it's kind of thrown out into the ether that people suddenly reform all the ways that they're going to do things without requiring them actually to report against them. There's no specific requirements. So I think not seeing it in a way of working, but seeing it in a collective way of what everyone is achieving together and making sure that country operations are required to do that. I think that will be the way to measure whether there's impact. We don't need more evaluations and more things to show, the Nexus is misunderstood and the processes are not, well working. I think it needs to make that kind of next step to look at kind of impact would be my sense.
Thanks, Damien. Okay, last word from Stephanie.
Thank you so much. And I will make this quick. I'm well aware of the time. Damien, I completely agree with you. But I think, one, we need to say how far along we've come, because, the Nexus has gone through many phases where we were even at one point, many actors didn't know what the Nexus was, or there was debating about the terminology and we're stuck in that rhetoric and we're not moving beyond that. I think there have been so much now opportunities and so many different opportunities in terms of awareness raising and learning that have come up, and different researches that really put us in a better place to where we understand and we grasp that this is an approach that we're dealing with. So yes, it's not a checkbox. We've done this many, events. It's really to make sure that how are we integrating it? Do we understand the meaning of it? Now, how can we monitor it though? Because that's something that's very important. There has to be accountability attached to this. And that's all that I want to leave here. We have to have some kind of accountability. And who does that go to? Well, we need to make sure that it's not a top-down process. The approach internally, even if it's led by the HCRC's office, whether it's led by some UN agency, whether it's led, you see that different INGOs have come together and put a thematic working to group together. It has to be inclusive. We need to see less silos, more communication. We need to see funding modalities that are fit for the purpose of funding models through the response. So I call on the donors here, because that's another way that we can see and measure and the success of the Nexus. There has to be accountability from the donors too. You can't just be asked to do that without the donors putting forth the funding to actually make this happen. We need to be able to increase equitable partnerships. We need to be able to be context specific. And I think those are some of the ways that we can help look to see that if we are conducting the Nexus approach and properly. And I'm sure that there's many other ways, but that's just a few for the minute that I have. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephanie. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I'm handing over back to Jen to close. Thanks, everyone.
Great. So thanks everybody. Thanks Corey and Sheetal as my hosts on this. And we hope that you'll join us for more Learning Curve events in the new year. A big thank you to all the discussants for bringing their experience and perspectives. And of course, to everybody who's been really participating in the comments. It's great to see so much discussion on these issues and trying to bring together these systems that often have their own siloed languages and ways of working that are so intrinsically linked in the lives of people, particularly in fragile contexts. And we hope you found this useful, and please stay in touch with us and enjoy the rest of your day or your evening ahead. Take care.